Thank you all for joining us today at this seminar for the Health Law and Ethics Network at Melbourne Law School. For those who don't know me, my name is Megan Prictor. I'm the co-director of the Health Law and Emerging Technologies Research Group here and Associate Dean of the JD program. I also want to welcome our many guests joining us online today. Thank you for joining and for your time. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Sarah de Heer as our guest speaker for today. I'll introduce Sarah and John Tobin as respondent and just outline how things will proceed today. So Sarah is a fourth-year doctoral researcher at the University of Lund, Faculty of Law in Sweden, and before becoming a doctoral student, she was a lecturer at the Faculty of Law at Maastricht University and gained professional experience in Brussels. Sarah is joining us somewhere through her PhD as a visiting scholar at Melbourne Law School, and we're very delighted to have her. And she's going to be speaking today about her research on AI medical devices in precision medicine and the right to health in the EU. Sarah will be speaking for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll invite Professor John Tobin to respond. John is our Chair in International Human Rights Law at Melbourne Law School and Director of Studies for the Human Rights Program in the Master of Laws, as well as co-director of research in human rights within the Institute for International Law and the Humanities, and with broad-ranging research interests in human rights, including the right to health. So looking forward very much to hearing from Sarah and John. I also finally, before we start, want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on unceded lands of Indigenous peoples here at Melbourne Law School. That is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. And if you're joining us online, feel free to post in the chat whose Indigenous country you are joining us from. But without further ado, I will hand over to Sarah, who's going to speak about her doctoral research. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Megan, for the introduction. So my name is Sarah, and today I'm going to present my doctoral research in AI-driven medical devices in precision medicine and the conformity assessment procedure and the right to health. I also need to mention that my doctoral project is part of a bigger funding grant given by WASP-HS. So let's start, and I would like to start by sketching the background. Let's have a look at scenario one. In scenario one, we have patient A, who is a 62-year-old woman. And she went to her physician because she experienced unexplained weight loss and stomach pain that spreads to the back. Her physician decided to test her blood with an AI-driven medical device in precision medicine that predicts the likelihood of pancreatic cancer. Based on the blood results, the physician diagnosed patient A with pancreatic cancer. Scenario two. Here we have patient B. Patient B is a 34-year-old male and is experiencing the same complaints or symptoms as patient A. He also goes to his physician, and his physician decides to order a CT scan. The CT scan results, unfortunately, were inconclusive, and his physician decided to order an endoscopic ultrasound and a fine needle biopsy to find out whether the mass is pancreatic cancer. The results were positive, meaning that he did indeed have pancreatic cancer. The main difference between these two scenarios is that in scenario one, we use an AI-driven medical device in precision medicine. So you might have already guessed, I will have to talk a lot about AI-driven medical devices and precision medicine. So let's introduce these two topics. When I talk about AI-driven medical device, I look at medical devices that are driven or based on AI. And this AI needs to have a bit of opacity, be a bit opaque, meaning that it is difficult to understand how input data became output data. Additionally, this AI needs to have a possibility to be inaccurate, basically meaning that the output is wrong. I'm also looking at, or another requirement for me in my research is that this AI-driven medical device needs to predict an outcome. And here I narrowed it down to a diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, diabetes diagnosis, or drug sensitivity, which basically means this type of drug will suit the patient quite well or quite poorly. Then we move on to precision medicine, and to explain that, I would like to counter that to the common day medicine, modern medicine. And in modern medicine, we diagnose people or treat people based on what is most suitable for a large group of patients. An example, say that I present at hospital with chest pain, pain in my jaw, shortness of breath. I will most likely be diagnosed with a heart attack. But not everybody presents the same symptoms, especially in this case, women. Women are more likely to have lower back pain, nausea, and not this evident feeling of there's an elephant on my chest. Same goes with treatment. If you have a history of heart diseases, you may be prescribed aspirin. It's not always the best medicine for women. In precision medicine, we try to treat and diagnose patients based on their data. That could be their environmental data, their lifestyle data, genetic data. So in precision medicine, we try to tailor the healthcare intervention towards a specific patient group, patient subgroup. Before moving on to the conformity assessment that forms a huge chunk of the PhD, I also want to acknowledge the field I'm looking into, the field of medicine. And the field of medicine has certain inaccuracies, potentially inherent. We could call them inherent inaccuracies. So first of all, when we look at medical devices, they are characterized by sensitivity and specificity, meaning either this medical device gives a certain percentage of true positive results, sensitivity, or rather specificity. This medical device gives a certain percentage of true negative results. We also need to talk about decisional shortcuts. And these are heuristics performed by medical professionals, and these are based on their own biases and experiences. They use this because they have seen a complaint so many times, so they could well say that patient A or B has a certain disease or illness. But sometimes this is wrong. So while they use these heuristics for efficiency, it could also be the outcome could be rather inaccurate. Moving on to bias in medicine, and there's a lot of bias in medicine, and I'm not going to discuss them all here or in the PhD. But I just want to focus on two types here: discriminatory bias and selection bias. Discriminatory bias, for instance, the example of heart attack in women. Women have so-called atypical symptoms. Selection bias means that in clinical trials, a certain segment of the population will engage in these clinical trials. Most likely people are healthier and already have a good health lifestyle. And then the last one is heterogeneity, both in patient and disease. What does this then mean? As regards the patient, it means that patients react differently to diseases, but also to treatments. As regards diseases, it means that diseases can present differently. An example is depression. Depression is classified in 4 major categories. So if you have depression category 1, that might give different symptoms than category 4. Now going to EU law. In the thesis, I specifically look at the medical devices regulation, the MDR, but also the counterpart of the MDR, the in vitro devices regulation, IVDR. The main difference is that MDR regulates devices on the body and in the body, but the in vitro devices regulation, IVDR, they need to base a diagnosis, for instance, on my blood, on patient sample. And then the infamous Artificial Intelligence Act, AI Act, which I think some of you might have heard of. I actually also look into, oh, that's on the side, sorry. I also look into Swedish law, but I'm not going to discuss that here today. And then we move on to a brief introduction into the MDR and the AI Act. These 2 legislative acts are so-called EU product safety legislation. And that means that they fall into a huge category with, amongst others, legislation on lifts, batteries, toys. And in 1985, we went to this new legislative approach, the so-called new approach, to counter against the old approach. It means that instead of in detail outlining what are the requirements for a toy to be on the European market, we just do the essential requirements, and other legislation, well, ISO standards will deal with the specifics. So, well, whenever the EU decides to adopt another EU product safety legislation act or act, we can identify a common framework. We see that the legislative objectives are similar, ensuring the smooth functioning of the internal market of the EU and protecting certain public interest, environmental interests, safety, health, and quite recently, fundamental rights. Conformity assessment procedures. All these, well, most of these products need to go through this so-called conformity assessment procedure to be allowed on the EU internal market. You fail this procedure, you don't get access. And market surveillance. After you enter the EU market, internal market, we have authorities, national authorities, surveilling the products. Are they still a risk? Is something happening here? Then moving on to the MDR. And I'm briefly going to touch upon legislative objectives. And in the MDR, we can identify 2, arguably more, but 2 legislative objectives according to the court and according to the Act itself. The first one is smooth functioning of the internal market. Second one, a high level or assuring a high level of protection of safety and health. So why do I actually mention these legislative objectives? Well, these are rather important in EU law. The EU does not have a legislative competence by itself. They need to look at the treaties to see whether or not they can legislate. As a result, the legislative powers, mandates they invoke, need to be reflected in these legislative objectives. And of course, there's a lot to say whether or not the function of the internal market is basically not literally everything. A huge discussion in EU law, and they may have reasons to think so. Then I would like to move on to the next slide, where I focus on, where I will explain what is a medical device. And in EU law, we have 3 requirements. First requirement is actually not a real requirement because it encompasses everything. It's a formal requirement, the form of the medical device, which is a very open category, and it literally everything fits in there. So also software. Then going to the substantive requirements. The first one is a medical purpose. This is also rather broad. It could be a diagnosis of a disease, treatment, prognosis, prediction of a disease, or it could be the monitoring of an injury, or also the treatment thereof. And it could be modifying your anatomy or your physiological state. Also really, really broad. So in our case, when we talk about AI-driven medical device in precision medicine, it's most likely diagnosis of a disease, cancer. And here we're going to move on to the manufacturer's intent. And this is a very important criterion. Manufacturer's intent means that the manufacturer of the medical device needs to mean that the medical device is used, or rather that product is used to diagnose cancer. So if this intent is lacking, there's no medical device, MDR is not applicable. No conformity assessment procedure, you can just enter the EU internal market. Moving on to then what is a medical device, so whether or not medical device software is a medical device. Yes. We don't really see it clearly in the MDR, but we have guidance from the Court of Justice, but also the Medical Devices Coordination Group. Well, medical devices, just being a medical device is not enough to determine your obligations under the MDR. You also need to fall within a certain risk group. And in the MDR, we have 4. Risk group 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. 1 is a rather lenient group. Most cases, you don't need to do conformity assessment procedure. 3 is very stringent. You get very stringent obligations. Then moving on to the AI Act. Here, legislative objectives. Yes, that is not a typo. No, that is not a typo. I did intend to include the question mark because it is not clear. You can already see there is a huge discussion on the legislative objectives of the AI Act. It's of course improving the functioning of the internal market because it's always internal market in EU law. Promoting uptake of AI systems, but also protecting health, safety, and fundamental rights. Protecting against harmful effects and supporting innovation. This is a lot, and I wonder whether the EU has competence to do this all, especially the third one. Then we move on to what is an AI system? So the AI Act regulates AI systems. Well, you can see on the slide, it's a very big definition. And if we look at all the criteria, if you can call them like that, individually, you see that it includes literally any AI system. Machine-based, most likely all AIs are based on a machine. Adaptiveness, meaning the self-learning ability. You have it, you're in it. You don't have it, that's fine too, because you may exhibit this adaptiveness. You need to pursue an objective, whether it's explicit or implicit, it's fine. And you need to you need to go from input to output, same comment, and you need to influence an environment. Scholars have mentioned that this is not a definition and it's more description, and I tend to agree. Moving on to the classification then in the AI Act. Maybe you have seen this triangle, it's very infamous. It basically explains the different types of AI systems we have, starting from the very top on unacceptable risk. These are AI systems that they present with unacceptable risks, and they are thus prohibited. They're not allowed on the internal market. Examples are exploiting vulnerabilities because of your economic background, because of your age, disability, and then that individual will then make a decision that actually harms them. So these AI systems, not allowed. Another AI system that's not allowed is AI systems that predict the risks of individuals committing crime, not allowed on the EU market. Then moving on to high risk. These AI systems have a high risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights, and are allowed on the EU market, but they have quite a few obligations or requirements, and we call them the Chapter 3, Section 2 requirements, and this includes data and data governance requirements. So the provider of AI system, high-risk AI system, need to ensure that the database is representative, etc. And also they need to ensure that it is accurate, that the output is accurate time and time again. Moving on to limited risk, these are then, they need to comply with what's called transparency obligations. And minimal risk, they do not have any obligations under the AI Act. And then we move on to the conformity assessment procedure. As already mentioned, obligatory procedure to go from to enter the EU market. The requirements depends on your classification. So only if you're a high-risk AI system, you need to go through conformity assessment procedure. Notified body. This is an independent conformity in a third-party assessment body that may or may not be involved in the conformity assessment procedure. And that depends on your classification. So sometimes we have a manufacturer-led conformity assessment procedure, and sometimes we have a third party seeing if the procedure or if the evidence in the file is decent. Well, if you pass this conformity assessment procedure successfully, you will get the CE marking, which you may or may not have seen, and this comes with a huge legal assumption, namely that you comply with all EU law requirements. And we move on to my benchmark, and I need to say that this is probably the least developed part of the manuscript. And so I specifically welcome feedback on the right to health. So what is my legal framework? As you can see, I'm looking into quite a lot of laws. On international level, Council of Europe, EU law, but also Swedish law. And in my, so I start with what is the right to health here. And that is that everybody is entitled to the highest attainable standard of health conducive to living a health and dignity. I follow legal scholars that argue that the right to health is built on 4 pillars: availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. And availability means that we should have sufficient medical devices on in the country. Accessibility means that availability is great, but if I don't have money to access it, maybe there's no accessibility. Acceptability means that that the medical devices need to be culture appropriate. And quality, then this is where I focus on, it means that it needs to be scientifically and medically appropriate. So while I do focus on quality, I also acknowledge that there is this interrelatedness between of AAAQ. If there is no quality, can we then really say it's accessible? If the quality is bad, will it be accepted? So this is the framework I use to define quality. I look into safety, whether or not the procedure is timely given, whether or not the procedure where the medical device is involved is timely given, effectiveness, efficiency, equitability, and patient-centeredness. And I struggle with this framework because I haven't yet come across a proper definition, at least on EU level, Swedish level. So yeah, feedback on this would be great. So one of the questions I ask in the thesis, or one of the main questions, is if whether or not the MDR and the AI Act can uphold quality in the EU. So are these medical devices safe, effective, and what about our fundamental rights under the AI Act? And I acknowledge that quality can both be advanced in its different dimensions, but also threatened. So for instance, when we look at accessibility, it could be good to use AI-driven medical device in precision medicine, because as in the scenarios I previously discussed, the patient A got a diagnosis real quick. Patient B had to wait a bit longer. But then again, it can also be threatened in a way, because not all AI-driven medical device in precision medicine can be used on everybody. Sometimes you need to have certain biomarkers. And then specifically for quality, I wonder whether they actually can improve. That is what is said, they improve patient outcome. But we do need to counter it against the inaccuracy of AI systems, and more specifically, the inaccuracy of, well, medicine as such. So I think that was the end, yes. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I'll hand over to John now.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much for outlining what is a very complex system in European context as well. So I've got lots of reflections. I don't want to spend too much time. And as I'm talking, I'm hoping that everyone else is thinking about possible questions as well we might present and give to Sarah. So my first observation is it's always reassuring for me to hear a scholar talking about the relevance of the right to health and human rights when it comes to issues around delivery of healthcare services. I've just come from a meeting with the director of the biomedical degree across in the University of Melbourne, and they're looking at sort of connections in the law school actually and the medical faculty as well. And I think there's a bigger place for conversations around rights. So I just want to sort of put that little message in there as well. In terms of just your model, so I'm thinking how I would go about this, and just again for you to accept or reject. So you talked about the right to health at the end of the presentation. I'd probably be beginning with the right to health, because that's where I start my conversation. And the reason I say that is because if you look at this issue through a rights-based lens, it'll be the right to health and all the other rights that are relevant as well. So it'll be physical integrity, violence, etc. as well. So there's a bigger non-discrimination. So probably a larger set of normative considerations to take into account to frame your model, to critique and examine to what extent does this particular procedure now comply with or undermine a rights-based approach, not just the right to health. So just flag that. I'm happy to have more conversations about what that looks like as well. Then the other thing to flag as well is that we tend to think of rights as being restrictive of what we should be doing when it comes to regulation of AI particularly as well. But in fact, the other thing, of course, to keep in mind is that if you go back to a definition of the right to the highest sustainable standard of health, that imposes obligations on states to take measures progressively to enable us to better realise the highest attainable standard of health, which means then being innovative, being creative, and supporting processes that might actually lead to better health outcomes. So in the context then of this, when you've got AI coming onto the scene, it's both a positive in that this may lead to better health outcomes, which goes to your point about how do we secure the right to health. And at the same time, there's a whole lot of risks. So this is the thing about rights. It's often seen as being either or, but in fact, it's actually both. So how do we create the appropriate balance? And so as I was listening to you speak, I was thinking then about, well, has the model that's been created in the European context created an appropriate balancing where it both innovates and supports developments in technology and AI development to allow for better health outcomes, and at the same time manages the risks that might be associated with this particular practice as well. And that's sort of, again, starting from that foundational idea of what does a rights-based approach look like to the delivery of these particular services as well. And then as you sort of start doing it, unpacking that, it starts to think about, well, balancing intervention. So even you talked about the first scenario where you have tests which are at some level of an invasion in terms of, taking body samples, and I've just gone through this myself. So, CT scans and blood things, what have you, and think, that's an interference with my bodily integrity. Could we minimize those interferences by using some sort of AI-driven device? And there's a possibility we could, right? So that's a positive. We're minimizing harm. So the whole human rights model is, what's your objective? Health, and then how do we achieve that objective? And that's both general medicine, but also now AI-assisted medicine in terms of how do we minimize interferences with other parts of your physical integrity and bodily integrity as well. So AI offers that possibility. Questions that come to mind then, well, what about the issue of bias, right? So you flagged a little bit of that as well. We know in all other areas of AI, when it comes to law enforcement or use by the state, there's a really significant problem with the way in which it generates its information, which is then used by policymakers or service providers as well. So how do we know that we're managing those biases here? And I think you flagged in your comments, particularly when issues concerning gender, we have a historical reliance on data that's been generated at scale, longitudinal studies, but invariably they're not particularly sensitive to a whole range of different attributes, gender, race, age, the whole range of things as well. So how are we creating systems in our regulation of this particular service that will address those biases? So it looks like the shiny new toy, but maybe it's just reinforcing the things that happen in traditional medicine as well. So how are we changing our data sets that actually allow us to shift it as well? So they're things that came to my mind. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about is this tension. So you talked a lot about ensuring the efficiency of the market. And this is always the great dilemma when it comes to healthcare, as we all know, to what extent do we, whose interests are being served by the models we create? So a human rights approach is in some ways agnostic about, privatised healthcare or public healthcare or whatever we might do, but it is not agnostic about what the overarching objective is. And it's actually to make sure we prioritise the achievement of the highest sustainable standard of health, not necessarily to make a lot of money for people in the process that might distort the system as well. So I don't know enough about the EU market, but it clearly is about enabling an efficient, effective market. Okay, that's obviously important, but for what end? To the end of allowing us to deliver high quality medical care to a much larger range of people, or to allow for us to make extra money for those developing the products. And of course, there's a legitimate aim there, of course, innovation and rewarding those who invest in these areas. But how's the balance being struck? What's that look like around efficient markets as opposed to effective delivery of healthcare services as well? And then just I won't keep rattling on because I could. A few reflections. A lot of the systems you talked about for me would look similar to what you'd have in place to have a regulatory system that tries to minimise interference with human rights. So the risk assessment you're making, so for those human rights types don't know, it's always about balancing, right? So it's not absolute, it's about balancing. So on balance, what does the evidence tell us is likely to be the most probable outcome, whatever it might be, in a health context, and how do we minimise interference with that particular person's rights? Or it could be bodily integrity or other risks that might be at stake as well. So it's clear to me that there's a whole range of systems built in that would have to be examined more closely about, well, have we created a process that both enables and supports the creation of new methods of diagnosing and treating people with health conditions, but at the same time putting in place safeguards that minimise the risks that we might perpetuate harms that have happened historically as well. That makes sense too. And the last point, just your model, the issue about what we call a 3AQ approach, where availability, accessibility, etc. Thinking about that as well, that's an example for me whereby you can probably bring in a broader range of rights and considerations. So we take, it's an equitable model. That sort of goes to the issue of non-discrimination and the requirement to take positive measures to address particular cohorts as well. Safety goes to bodily integrity. So that's an example whereby your model you're trying to create will have, obviously, realisation of health at its core, but within that context, what other rights become really critical relevant to make sure we deliver that? So, non-discrimination, bodily integrity, agency and autonomy, all those things become part of the model you might want to create to allow you to say, when we examine and critique this, we can both create a model that will best align with the realisation of the right to health and taking on board the benefits of AI-driven precision medicine, but at the same time mitigate the risks as best we can, keeping in mind it's not absolute a lot of the time. Again, it's the process. So what measures are being put in place by the EU, by individual states, to say we are using as much evidence as we can to address both the benefits but also the risks, particularly around bias, I think, in the way in which we generate the system and how we're balancing against that market-based tension, which always makes me a bit anxious when we start talking about the interests of markets as opposed to the individuals and their right to health as well. So I'll sort of finish there. But again, this is a really interesting space, right, where we're changing the way we deliver medical services. There's vested interests in it for a lot of individuals, but there's also the possibility of great benefits. And from a rights-based perspective, we're trying to centre those benefits and not necessarily, I don't want to be cynical, but making other people much more wealthy than they already are as well. So I might just finish it there. But again, thank you for providing a really clear, very detailed examination of what is a really interesting new area of law, which will create challenges for all of us going forward.
Well, thank you so much. And I think it's interesting that you also pinpointed the things I'm very much struggling with. So I'm very happy to hear that it's a shared concern or a shared struggle, so to say. But no, I agree. Whenever especially in EU law, it is market-based legislation. We started as a community for coal and I think steel, and that is something that we can see in EU law always. There's this market-based interest, and whenever we want to add fundamental rights, it's painful. And it's specifically the right to health, because even though we have a charter in EU law, the right to health is not protected therein. So it makes it very difficult to protect or to consider right to health concerns in EU legislation. I think I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So please join me in thanking Sarah and in thanking John. So our next Helen seminar is on the 21st of July at 1 o'clock with Sinead Prince on genetic enhancement. It will be both in person and via Zoom. So please feel free to join the Helen mailing list to get all of the latest news and presentations on in this seminar series. And yeah, thank you all for coming along and have a great rest of your day.